briefly summarize what you would see as a positive outcome in terms of principles from Copenhagen?
Well, I think we have to get a comprehensive architecture, a framework from Copenhagen, and covering the 5 areas that I said in the lecture need to be covered in agreement. First, an agreement on the objective. And I suggested that we were heading towards concentrations or 450 parts per million, or the European version of that, trying to hold the mean expectation of temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Secondly, we would need to start to discuss principles for allocating the implicit budget for greenhouse gas emission entitlements amongst countries. Now, we won't get there in one shot at Copenhagen, but we at least have to begin a discussion of principles. We haven't had that yet. We're into political arm wrestling about who does more and who does less without having any principles. So let's begin a process and define a subsequent process where we define the allocation of the budget across countries, and it's especially in this area where a lot more work is going to be required, where we won't be ready at Copenhagen to get the agreement. The third is relatively straightforward, I think, and that is we need to agree that what we're talking about is emissions entitlements with opportunities for trade in entitlements and not actual emissions. And in that context, I would like leaders to agree that the various project-oriented or sector-oriented arrangements that are now in place, like the CDM mechanism, are transitional, and they will all disappear, and that we're heading towards a system in which trade is it takes the form of countries all with binding caps, selling permits if they do better than those caps and buying them if they don't do as well. The fourth would be an agreement on a commitment to support for research, development and commercialisation of low emissions technologies. There's been a fair bit of discussion on this, and the British in particular have been trying to lead discussion on it. I think maybe we could get a fair way with that in Copenhagen. And the fifth, I think we could get a fair way at Copenhagen. That's commitments by developed countries to provide more development assistance for adaptation in the poorest developing countries. So it's really that second item that we haven't done the groundwork for, and that's the one that I would like to see heads of government setting up groups of people to do a lot of nitty-gritty work.
I've got 2 or 3 questions I'd like to ask Ross going outside the climate change area, but since we've been so intense on that so far, let me just turn to the floor and see if people in the audience would like to ask further questions on the greenhouse gas issue that's been the focus. Bill Klein. Microphone's coming.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture. A couple of observations or questions. You don't seem to allow any difference for country geography in per capita emissions. One would have thought there's a difference between Hong Kong and Texas, just for transportation. And that partly explains the U.S.-Australia departure from the average. China, they're now at 5 tons per capita of CO2 per year. If their 40% increase is realized and they grow at only 7% for the next decade, they'll be at 7 tons. Eventually they have to converge to 2 tons. So it's not totally obvious that they should be given total carte blanche, because they're already above where they've got to go. And from 1990 to 2007, they had an annual 1% decrease in the carbon efficiency of their energy in a period when the European Union had a 1% annual increase in carbon efficiency, and U.S. held constant. So some nuances on China. Third, you seem to imply that the giveaways of the quotas for political purposes has a bad economic effect as well as a bad fiscal effect and distributional effect. Setting aside the fiscal, I would have thought that marginal pricing would have meant that as long as they're tradable, you might not like who gets it, but it'll be absolutely no difference from a carbon tax consequence. I wonder if you'd have any comments on any of these observations.
Okay, and thanks, Bill, for all of your work, which I used and cited extensively in my review. Pioneering work, and we're all grateful for that. On the first issue, yes, there are big countries, especially big countries without many people like ours. I think that's a reason why we should have more higher entitlements per capita. Cold countries think that they should have more because they're cold. I don't know any country that hasn't got very good reasons why its entitlements shouldn't be greater than any others. And I ended up concluding, I did a fair bit of work and had a team working on all sorts of permutations, and ended up forming the view there wasn't going to be a stable basis for an agreement that in the end wasn't based on population. This is something that all the substantial countries have got to sign up to. India's got to sign up to it, and they're probably the hardest of the significant countries in this, as in most international economic discussions. And as a pragmatic judgment, I ended up forming the view that the only basis for a stable agreement is going to be per capita entitlements. Now, that allows quite large differences in actual emissions. One of the reasons why Australia, and to a lesser extent Canada and the United States, has high emissions per capita is that we embody a lot of emissions in things that we export. United States not as much as it used to, but certainly Australia, we're the world's biggest aluminium exporter. If you've got comprehensive carbon pricing, then the price of emissions will to some extent be embodied in global prices for emissions intensive products. So you're buying more permits, but you're getting a higher price for your product. And once you've got comprehensive carbon pricing, a lot of the need to buy, the cost of buying higher numbers of permits comes out in the wash. On your second issue of China, China did very well in reducing energy intensity of production in the 90s, and then made no headway in reducing energy intensity in the first half dozen years of the 21st century. The reason for the difference is in the 90s they were putting a price for the first time on energy as they moved away from central planning, and that gave a lot of easy gains, and they'd exhausted those by 2000. And China and India and Indonesia, the three big developing countries, accounting for a very high proportion of the world's growth in emissions now, all are at a stage of development where growth is naturally very energy intensive. If you don't have deliberate policies, growth is very energy intensive. So I think what was happening to China in the first half dozen years of this century is a fairly natural thing in the absence of rather strong policies. It's taken fairly strong policies of the Chinese government to get on the path that would be embodied, for example, in the 45% reduction in emissions intensity by 2020, and I give them a fair bit of credit for it. And I think they will eventually become confident that they can go further than that. But it has taken new policies, some of them fairly ugly policies, restrictions on expansion of energy-intensive industries like aluminium, cement and steel, a ban for the moment on new steel mills, often honoured in the breach when provincial governments seek to contest national government policy, but effective in many places. the energy-intensive industries don't get the benefit of export rebates from the value-added tax, unlike all of Australia's or Europe's or Japan's energy-intensive export industries. So it's an extra tax on energy-intensive industries. They're discussing an energy tax, and I'm hopeful that after last week's announcement it will become an emissions tax, which obviously would be more effective in reaching the objective. So I think that what they've announced embodies a lot of important policy change and very large efforts to promote the low emissions energy, and they are greatly encouraged by how fast that's going. Last couple of years, for the first time, it's really got underway, and you've had the renewable share of energy supply increased by a full percentage point in the last year. That's taken the Chinese a bit by surprise. So let's not underplay how much they've actually done, and I think there's more to come through. On the third issue, whether the issue of free permits is only an income distribution question, and you said apart from the fiscal issue, well, I don't think in today's world, after the great crash with the US multi-trillion-dollar budget deficit or wherever it's got to, I don't think you can say apart from the fiscal problem. The fiscal problem is the economic problem, and so something that is central to that can't be ignored. And the other problem I see is the absence of principles as you hand out free permits and political processes distorts the trading system. So I don't contest that. I don't say that the issue of free permits is bad on environmental grounds, so long as each country is committed to reaching its target and stays committed no matter what the economic cost. The problem is an economic problem, a budget problem, and a huge distortion of the global trading system that's going to hurt us a lot more as time goes by.
Ross, you're one of the world's great experts on China, and I'd like to broaden the discussion a little bit by asking you to elaborate what you said on China in this context. The way you described China's recent policies toward global warming, you didn't use the term, but suggest a certain amount of leadership in responding to the world problem. Unexpected leadership from some point. Do you see that as a harbinger of the future in broader terms? Do you think China is likely to play an increasingly central and responsible role in providing leadership in dealing with global economic issues, at least, in a variety of topic areas, like trade, like finance, like investment, where, as now the world's almost largest trading country, major beneficiary, highly open economy, it clearly has a national interest in doing so?
Well, I hope so, because the world's got no chance on any big issue without China playing a major role from now on. It's that important. But on the climate change issue, they've got their own reasons for being worried. A lot of good science in China, and there's a lot of science in China drawing attention to the risks of global warming to China, and they focus on three big risks. One a pretty frightening one for our part of the world, and that's deglaciation of the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, which could destabilize river flows in the Yangtze, the Yellow River, but also in the great rivers of Southeast Asia, the Mekong and the Irrawaddy, and the great rivers of South Asia, the Indus, the Brahmaputra, the Ganges. An awfully high proportion of human beings live on the floodplains of those rivers, and China's very much aware that if you take away those big glaciated areas, you've lost the stability in those river flows, which has been there for 10,000 years. We've had equable for 10,000 years, and that's the 10,000 years in which human civilization developed, mostly on those rivers. Chinese science is saying that's at risk. They're worried about sea level rise because a very high proportion of the new industrial capacity of China is on those coastal river deltas. The Pearl River Delta, the country between in the triangle, Guangzhou, Macau, Hong Kong, and the delta of the Yangtze, the Shanghai area, spreading into Zhejiang and Jiangsu province, the port of an industrial area of Ningbo, Tianjin. The Chinese low-lying areas aren't the first problems that most people think about when they think about risk from sea level rise, but they're the first ones the Chinese think about. And then there's drying of and warming of the North China Plain, which Chinese science says is already having effects, and there's 250 million people there connected in one way or another to agriculture who are vulnerable to what the science says may come with climate change. So this is an issue in which it's an international problem, but one in which China recognizes itself as having a big interest. And certainly Wen Jiabao, the Premier, is personally very interested in this. He has a climate change group, including some of the Chinese scientists who are working on these things. And from what I hear, he takes seriously the meetings of this group. It meets regularly. And more generally, China's place in the international system. Well, I think in the aftermath of the Great Crash, and I've got a chapter of the book on this, we're seeing an acceleration of a tectonic shift that we've been aware of for some time, the growth in the power of and weight of the big Asian developing countries, and decline of relative weight of the old industrial countries in North America and Western Europe. We're seeing quite a rapid acceleration of that tectonic movement. And I think we're moving fairly quickly towards a world in which there are 4 economic entities with great weight, none with the sort of dominance that the US had after the Cold War, probably in the whole post-war, post-Second World War period, but a world in which, unless the United States, China, what I think will become over time an increasingly integrated European Union, although there are not many signs of it right at the moment, and before too long India, unless these 4 weighty powers are comfortable about some international development, it's not going to happen. In this quadrupolar world, there's a bipolar core, and that's the United States and China. So I don't think the international system on any big issue is going to work without Chinese participation. The Chinese are starting to realize that. The Great Crash is a pity because it doesn't leave us with enough time to think through all the systemic changes that we need to make the new system work. When it was a slow tectonic movement, we could all think about it. The Chinese could think about it, Americans could think about it, your friends could think about it, we could all talk about it, and we had time. Well, it's happening very quickly now, and my worry is that China and India won't adjust fast enough to the idea that they are at the center of the international system, and therefore might be slower than we need to take a full measure of responsibility.
But the crash had the virtue of forcing that process to move and to accelerate. Anyway, my G2 becomes your G4. That's fair enough. I must say, in elaboration of your point about China's interest in controlling greenhouse warming, to me the most striking image in Al Gore's movie was the satellite shot of what happens to the world when the oceans rise. And within that, to me, the most notable part was that Shanghai and the surrounding area is underwater. Marina.
Well, just one comment aside. I was interested that your 4-power quadrilateral, or whatever it is, made no mention of Japan, which I'm sure would give the Japanese fits. But it's just that it's interesting because in the last 20 years, Japan has always surfaced as the kind of third area. But my question is, that we read constantly that the thing that China is most concerned about is social stability or instability. And yet it looks as if they've managed to make quite draconian rules that one would think would cause the kind of social instability they worry about, and yet they seem to have pulled it off, whereas we seem to have great difficulty in making changes that have any kind of distributional implications.
Yeah. Well, first on Japan, I do say in the book The Great Crash of 2008 that for a transitional period, the division between the four and the rest will not be so clear-cut, and Japan is the first of the others. Japan is a great economic power. It will remain a wealthy country, but its population is 10% of that of China, and China is converging rapidly towards developed country levels of productivity. It'll be there sometime in the 20s, and when it gets there, it'll be 10 times as big an economy as Japan. There'll just be a very big gap between, and my story depends on continued success in India, and that of course will take longer. But I'm very optimistic about the momentum of growth in India. I think it's going to get there. It'll get there later, obviously, than the others. But on social stability in China, well, yes, the Chinese leadership is neuralgic on social instability, and they have got away with very firm actions of control of instability. I think China's at a stage of development where an authoritarian government's got quite a lot of things on its side. When people are rapidly enjoying a better standard of living, and it's so obvious that lives are much better now than 10 years ago and 20 years ago, that introduces a lot of ballast in support of the system, and I think that a regime can get away with more while that's happening. Now, as incomes rise further, as education improves right through the society, you're still going to have a lot of concern for stability through the Chinese polity of people who want the good times to keep getting better. But there will come a point, I have no doubt, where China will turn out to be similar to every other society, a point in the growth of incomes, the improvement of education, of communications, in which people do demand a larger say in what happens to them personally. And so there will come a time when stability in China is going to depend on government in a timely manner making adjustments in the political superstructure. And whether it does that smoothly or as a result of crisis will depend on the quality of leadership at the time. And the range of possibilities can be seen in the range of responses to the Tiananmen demonstrations in 1989, where the Politburo was split. The Standing Committee of the Politburo was split, with Zhao Ziyang and Hu Qili taking a very different position to Yao Yilin and Li Peng. And it was only the presence outside the formal leadership of a grand figure who could command the loyalty of parts of the army, Deng Xiaoping, that led to the result that we saw. Deng won't be around next time, and that wider range of responses will interact to produce the outcome. Chinese leaders think and talk about these things. I've enjoyed conversations about the political transformation in Britain in the 19th century, where Gladstone and Disraeli were not Democrats. The British elite of the 19th century thought democracy was pretty horrible, but recognized that the alternative might be a French Revolution. And so you had the leadership of the British elite making adjustments ahead of pressure for them. And Chinese leadership is very interested in that example, as well as in the examples of countries which haven't handled smoothly the democratic transition. The reaction in the United States that led to the Great Civil War, the early 20th century history of Japan and Germany. So these are difficult and open questions, but I've got no doubt that in the times in future in which these issues become pointed issues, there will be elements in the Chinese leadership that will see stability coming through making adjustments in the political system. There may be others with a different view, and if the others are strong, there'll be difficult times for China.
Well, with those sweeping and fascinating views, we have unfortunately reached our witching hour. We could go on at least for another hour asking Ross many more questions on many more topics, but I always promise to let you go as scheduled. So I want to thank Ross very, very much for being with us again. I want to thank Marina and Bob Whitman for sponsoring this particular series. Thanks to all of you for coming. Meeting adjourned.